Hello, everyone. My name is Shahan Ali Maiman, and today I'll be presenting my paper on characterizing COVID-19 misinformation communities using a novel Twitter dataset. So let's begin. From conspiracy theories to fake cures and fake treatments, COVID-19 has sort of become a hotbed for the spread of misinformation online. And examples of this include 5G causing COVID-19 conspiracy, using hydroxychloroquine as a COVID-19 cure, and so on. On the right, you see a visual created by someone that includes more than 500 different conspiracies related to COVID-19. Now, social media is sort of known to facilitate the propagation of misinformation. And since public actions affect public health and safety directly, right now it's more important than ever to identify methods to debunk and correct false information online. That's not exactly what we do in this study. That is, we do not present any machine learning based model for misinformation detection. What we were interested in was to look at communities formed around COVID-19, specifically within the context of misinformation. And the way we characterize these communities is by comparing them against each other. More concretely, the goals of the study were to understand the behavior of competing COVID-19 misinformation communities. And when I say competing within the study, what we mean is informed versus misinformed community. We wanted to understand their network structure, understand their linguistic choices and communication patterns, and how those choices inform us about their values and social identities. The secondary goals of this study were also to collect a diverse set of annotated COVID-19 Twitter dataset and create a comprehensive COVID-19 annotation codebook. Both of these things we make available for the public for them to use in their research. So let me begin by first describing our dataset that we call CMU MISCOV 19. And so we collect our data set on 3 different days in March, mid-June, and end of June using the Twitter search API. This gives us data from 3 different weeks. We use popular hashtags related to COVID-19 and manually selected keywords to different misinformation themes. To our annotators, we give an annotation codebook consisting of 17 categories. This codebook that you see here was created after a long back and forth discussion amongst a group of researchers within Carnegie Mellon. The different categories in our dataset include irrelevant, conspiracy, true treatment, true fact, fake cure, fake treatment, false fact or prevention, correction or calling out. We also include categories such as sarcasm or satire, true public health response, false public health response, politics. There's some tweets that are ambiguous or difficult to classify. Then there's commercial activity or promotion, emergency response, news, panic buying. If you may notice, we do not simply annotate different misinformation categories, but also true information categories. We also include other categories such as news or panic buying and politics. For the purposes of this study, we do not use these categories as such, but we have included them anyways for completeness. And because we found many instances of these in our dataset while annotations. Now, if we separate misinformation from true information, then this is how we could create the division where in the red, you see different misinformation categories such as conspiracy, fake cure, fake treatment. And in the green, you see true information. So this includes true treatment, true fact, correction or calling out. Even sarcasm and satire can be characterized as true information. In gray, you see categories that belong to neither of those previous categories. For our study, it was sort of important to create this sort of division, as later when we want to identify communities, it makes it easier for us. And this is sort of an important point to understand, because when you're looking at other misinformation communities such as anti-vaxxers versus pro-vaxxers, then it's easy to sort of classify users into these different communities, anti-vaxxers versus pro-vaxxers. That is because you can define a stance related to vaccination. If you're talking about COVID-19, there is no particular stance related to COVID-19 because there's so many different themes going on, and each of them could have their own stance. And so there has to be a way to define a membership of each of the users within the 2 communities that we have defined. And in this case, those communities are informed community and misinformed community. And so the way we do it is basically we look at the types of tweets that they do and which categories they belong to. And as we'll see later, how we use this sort of division into red and green group to identify communities. The total number of users in our published dataset are around 3,629, and they have tweeted around 4,573 tweets that we include in our dataset that are annotated. Most of these annotations are annotated by one annotator, with an exception of 651 tweets, for which we get second annotation as well, just for the sake of validation. On the right, you see a screenshot of our published dataset that you can find on this link. In terms of the data distribution, our data is very diverse in both categorical and topical sense. So in categorical distribution, you'll see that correction or calling out and conspiracy sort of form the largest categories. In topical distribution, hydroxy, chloroquine, or malaria-related tweets, bleach, bioweapon, and Trump-related tweets sort of form the most of the chunk of the largest chunk of the categories. Of course, our data set is not the only COVID-19 related data set out there. Most of the data sets that were published related to COVID-19 at the time of submission of this paper were generic in nature. So they did not have any annotations related to them. The other set of data sets that actually had annotations either employed automated annotations using transfer learning or semi-supervised methods, or were not specifically designed for misinformation. A few data sets that were had sort of similar properties to our data set either were very small in size, or they did not include a diverse set of categories such as ours. Our data set, on the other hand, is relatively large, is related to misinformation. There are manual annotations, and there are around 17 different categories. We also differentiate between the different types of misinformation. Now, because our goal is to characterize communities and not detect misinformation, we also collected the timelines of users to augment our data. This also helps avoid survivorship bias in our dataset that may have been introduced due to windowing of the time period. And it also increases the diversity of the content. Given this dataset, as I already mentioned, we want to identify users into the two communities. So in this case, informed versus misinformed users. Now, because we've already annotated data across a set of true and false information categories, we identify the membership of users by assigning a valence of +1 to true information categories and -1 to false information categories. And at the end, we compute the valence of each of the users as a weighted sum of the valence of the annotations assigned to their tweets. So in this case, if the valence is greater than 0, the user belongs to informed community or misinformed community. And if it's 0, then it's ambiguous. Our analysis is conducted on 1,697 informed users and 1,043 misinformed users. There are other users that have tweeted about politics or panic buying and other categories that are discarded and regarded as irrelevant users to our analysis. In terms of our analysis, the first kind of analysis we do is network analysis. And the way we do it is basically we extract only COVID-related tweets from timelines. And then we extract the mention, retweet, and reply network of the users. And we combine them into one big network. We note that both informed and misinformed users sort of display echo chamberness, with misinformed users being much denser than informed community, as shown in the table here. We do, however, notice some two-way communication from both sides, and this is particularly evident in the reply network here. To understand the role of bots within the two competing groups, we used Bot Hunter to identify bots within misinformed and informed groups. We observed that from a total of 3,629 users, 14% of the users are identified as bots. The percentage of bots with identified misinformed users, however, is much higher than with identified informed users. This sort of indicates that around 1/5 of the misinformation related posts in our dataset are potentially a result of disinformation campaigns related to COVID-19. The next sort of analysis we do is linguistic analysis, and to understand the linguistic differences between the two competing communities, what we do is that we run the linguistic inquiry and word count program on the set of tweets that we have. This program, which is abbreviated as LUKE, is a text analysis tool, and it looks at different lexical categories, each of which is psychologically meaningful. What I mean by lexical categories is categories such as pronouns, function words, and so on. And so what it basically does is that if you give it a text, it will tell you the percentage of words that are pronouns, percentage of words that are function words, and so on. So we run the Luke program on the timelines of all the members for each of the two competing groups. We only use tweets that are relevant to COVID-19 and remove any retweets. We also remove users that are identified as bots. Because some users may be more active than others, using the results of the program as its may introduce bias in our analysis. And so to account for those biases, we first normalize the percentages by the size of the data for each user. And then we use the mean of the normalized Luke indices of tweets of individual users for a given lexical category as our test statistic. In this case, we are looking at 4 dimensions in particular. And these include narrative discourse structure, tone, which describes how positive a given text is, linguistic formality, and linguistic uncertainty. Linguistic uncertainty, we look at it because in the past, the literature has suggested that dense communities with high echo chamberness tend to be more certain of their behavior. And so we want to test it within the COVID-19 communities as well. The different correlates of each of those dimensions are here. Just to go through one example here. So for linguistic uncertainty, you would see all words such as always, never being as negative correlates, and perhaps being a positive correlate of linguistic uncertainty. For linguistic formality and linguistic uncertainty, our results are inconclusive as we don't see much of a difference between the two communities. In terms of tone, the Luke program gives an index for it from 0 to 100. And if the index is less than 50, that means the tone is negative. What we observe here is that both informed and misinformed users have a highly negative tone. In terms of the narrative discourse structure, in the past, we have found that misinformed communities tend to use many more pronouns, which suggests sort of a narrative discourse structure. In this analysis, however, we find that informed users in the COVID-19 discourse use significantly more pronouns, significantly more function words, are much more authentic, are less analytical. All of these different correlates suggest that informed users use many more narratives than misinformed users. This is sort of an interesting finding as it presents a dichotomy between the different misinformation communities. In this case, anti-vaxxers versus COVID-19 misinformed community. In the hindsight though, this is an intuitive result, as our informed group is obtained from a corrective discourse where users present their stories of family members or friends suffering from COVID-19 to call out conspiracies or false information. So it sort of makes sense that this is the case. Now, because the two communities still seem to have a less two-way communication, this also suggests that just the content and framing of the message may not be enough if you want to conduct any sort of message intervention. Because in the past, literature has suggested that using narratives is a good messaging strategy, and From our analysis, what we find is that may not be enough. What you may also need to do is find a medium where these two communities can interact with each other and connect somehow. Finally, to understand the interplay between the different kinds of misinformation themes and communities, we identify the vaccination-related stance of members of misinformed community. The way we do it is we first identify the subset of misinformed community who have posted at least one tweet related to vaccination in the past. We then collect the user to hashtag co-occurrence network. We use the valence of the vaccination hashtags in a weighted combination to identify the stance of users. And finally, we identify the bots within pro and anti-vaxxers. What we see here is that around 41% of the users that are that are identified as COVID-19 misinformed users are also anti-vaxxers. What we also see here is that a large chunk of these users are bots. So 22% of the identified misinformed users, anti-vaxxers, are bots. And this, it's the first thing that this suggests is that big chunk of COVID-19 misinformation online may in fact be disinformation and hence intentional. The existence of bots within both the informed and misinformed communities also sort of suggests that much of the disinformation online may be an organized effort to amplify COVID-19 debate to create discord in communities, as seen in the past with Twitter bots and Russian trolls. And so, in summary, we find that both misinformed and informed users have a highly negative tone within their tweets. Informed users use significantly more pronouns, function words, and family words, which suggests that they use many more narratives. Misinformed users are much more organized and have higher network density than the informed users. Informed users show significantly more signs of narrative discourse structure. Informed users within the COVID-19 discourse may be less analytical than misinformed users, and that informed users are more authentic, honest, humble, and personal than misinformed users. The limitations of our work include, of course, that most of our work is correlational in nature and not causational. There is some survivorship bias that we try to mitigate. The number of annotations per tweet are one, mostly with the exception of around 600 tweets that have a second annotation as well. Our data collection strategy cannot be used for studying dynamics as we collected on 3 different time periods. We make a second level bot inference, but we try to increase our confidence threshold to 75% to mitigate this. Finally, because there is no stance related to COVID-19, this is something that needs to be explored in future studies. In terms of future work, of course, looking deeply into narrative discourse structure is one of the possible directions. We could look at the dynamics of misinformed communities. We could also test the effectiveness of messaging in an observational fashion or in an experimental fashion. And finally, because we release this data set, we sort of invite researchers to use this data set if they want to create a model around misinformation detection. And so I am out of time now. Thank you everyone for attending my presentation. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here because I had to travel, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me and I'll try to respond it as soon as possible. Thank you all, and bye-bye.